everybody, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, talking today about bishops of opposite color. Many of our regular assumptions about chess appear to break down when there are bishops of opposite color on the board. The first exception to the rule that every chess player experiences at some time or another is that in bishops versus bishops of opposite color, the side with an overwhelming material advantage will often find it difficult or impossible to win. Mr. Pascal did a nice lecture on some of these anti-intuitive positions in his lecture called Fundamental Positions Opposite Colored Bishops. And this is one of those positions. It seems like white has everything, and in fact this position he can actually win, but if we just adjust it a little bit, he won't be able to. So two connected passed pawns winning in almost basically every other kind of endgame. Very difficult to win here. I think if we shift the pawns one to the left, or if we move them one down, it'll be impossible to win. So this is what most people know, and this is kind of the first exception of the rule, which gives the bishop of opposite color the reputation of being drawish. It turns out, however, that when we add pieces to the board, we need to completely rework our assumptions. What we find is that with more pieces on the board, and here really I've just added a rook, the value of the initiative skyrockets. It rises so much that we can say in opposite color position with some material remaining, the side with the initiative will win. Now, the reason for this is not obvious. Initiative is always important, but it rises in importance once we have bishops of opposite color. And the reason is this. If we develop an initiative, that initiative will be conducted on the same color as our bishop. Right? Like in this position, white has a light square bishop, and he wants to develop an initiative on the light squares. He can't do anything on the dark squares. But the problem for black is that his bishop only touches the dark squares. It's as if he's in a different universe. So he can't oppose the white bishop. And that's his fundamental problem. So if he can't oppose me on the light squares and can't get an attack going of his own, then I'm free to basically have an extra piece on the light squares. And that's the important point to bear in mind. If I get an initiative going, you don't have a piece to block my bishop, and it's like I have an extra piece. That's why the initiative is so important once we get bishops of opposite color. Notice here, I thought this was kind of funny, is that in Mr. Pascal's lecture, we also had pawns on f5 and e5. There we were trying to queen. Here I want to use those pawns to create an initiative. This game was taken from Kraai versus a young player named, I think, Teddy Coleman, who was about 2200 USCF, and maybe we'll hear more from him soon, one of our top junior players. And this was in December at the North American Open. And my sense was, just from his body language, was that he thought that this should be easily a draw. And that's kind of how I knew I was going to win, because I knew that you really have to appreciate the second exception to the rule, which is once there's another piece on the board, you can't think that it's going to be a draw. The initiative is going to be too important. Let's look at how this game went. He actually had a lot of time. I didn't have much time. So in this position, my opponent played rook e8, which he's stuck on the back rank, and it's hard for his king to get out. So in a way, this move is understandable. I can't take on b6 right away due to bishop c5 check. But the problem is now he's committing himself, I think, to what I'd call the exception of the first rule, which is he's thinking to himself, okay, if I just blockade all of white's pawns, it'll be a draw. But with the rooks on the board, it's not going to be easy. And in fact, I think that's a mistaken way of thinking. So I played e6, takes, g6, bishop d5. These were time pressure moves. I'm just making normal moves, trying to make time control. And he played rook e7. And the rook e7 I'm a little bit more critical of. Notice what his philosophy here is. He's thinking to himself, well, if I just blockade the pawns, it'll be a draw. But I think rook e7 is a really critical mistake, because what happens is the rook on e7 loses a lot of its mobility. For example, this pawn on e6 is going to take away f7 and d7 from the rook's mobility. And he's just going to be stuck. That means he's going to be passive. It is, however, hard to give him much of a recommendation. And the basic problem he's facing is he has to worry he's going to have to worry about the pawn on e6, and he's going to have to worry about my rook penetrating to the 7th. But if he just remains passive, then I'm going to be able to improve my position. And we'll find, even though I'm not even up any pawns, like in Pascal's example, I have the initiative, and that's what's going to be important. Okay, so I just played a normal move, king f3, still in time pressure, bishop c5, and now I played a4, threatening a5, undermining the bishop's place on c5. So he played a5, which was what I was gunning for. And this strategy that White just did would be called fixation of the structure. That's what the Russians call it, fixatio structurae. And all that's happened now is, now I'm really legitimately basically up a pawn. The pawn on b6 will never become a threat. So that means that my long-term initiative is basically secured. He won't be able to do anything. Okay, so I played king e4. My opponent brings his king up, king g7, king e5. Here are just time pressure moves. I'm just making normal moves to approach the center of the board. And now my opponent plays h6. I think this is the beginning of the wrong plan, even though it is going to be a little bit difficult now for black. He's thinking that he's going to put his pawns on dark squares. And let's just see how that works, actually, just so we can talk about it once we get the position. He played g4. I played g4. Maybe not the best, but I was in time pressure. Rook c2. And he comes back. Bishop e4. And now he plays g5. So he's really thinking according to this first rule of just blockading my pawns and taking away what he sees as the possible weaknesses of his pawns in the light squares, so he puts them on dark squares. But this is really wrong-headed, because see, what happens now is that his pawns on dark squares prevent his own bishop from acquiring greater mobility. That is, they get in the way of his bishop. And on the other hand, they don't block my bishop, which really they would like to do. For example, now my bishop just gained a powerful scope all the way down to h7 due to those pawns having moved. It already controls all of these queenside squares over here. It's a huge piece. Yeah, so I think one thing that's interesting is Nimzovich talks about the rook on the 7th, and how if we clear all the pawns from the 7th, that's actually a good thing, because then the rook attains an absolute scope. And a similar thing is happening with the bishop. By having my opponent move all the pawns out of the way, it's true that he's not going to win any pawns anytime soon, but his scope, and that's the important thing, especially in a game where we want initiative, his scope has been dramatically increased. So here, I think what's important to see is, even though the bishop of opposite color situation violates so many known rules that we've just discussed, like material being of different importance, initiative being of different importance, one principle that I think remains the same is that of the principle of two weaknesses. And here, that's going to be my basic strategy. I have to use the fact that this e6 pawn is essentially a weakness for black, because he always has to keep him in check. and I have to use the fact that the b6 pawn might become a problem as well. The b6 pawn in itself isn't such a big deal, but if I win the b6 pawn, then I'll win the a5 pawn. Plus, we'll see that this bishop now having scope down to h7 will be helpful to me as well. Okay, I just played a simple move, h3. It was 38th move. We're still in time pressure, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. Bishop b4, rook c8, bishop a3, king d5, bishop b4, and now we've reached time control. So now I had more time to think about things. Now, first of all, one thing that I did here that I thought was reasonable was I didn't rush things. And Mr. Pascal's talked about that in some of his lectures too, and I've really seen that in a lot of old Karpov games, is that there's no rush. And it's particularly annoying for the opponent. I think that's the most important thing in my eyes, is that if we just sit around and he can't do anything, the opponent will often become frustrated, and we see that in this game as well. Okay, so I just play bishop f5. He can't do anything. He can't really move. If he plays king f6, I can play rook h8, and that's the end of the game, because on king f6 I have rook h7. Note the power of the scope of the bishop that enabled that tactic. So the king can't move. The rook really doesn't have anywhere useful to go. So he plays bishop a3. C5, bishop b4, right. Bishop f5, bishop a3, and now I come back, bishop d3. Bishop b4, bishop b5. So, what am I doing here? I think this position is probably won, and that was surprising to me during the game. I mean, I knew I had an advantage, but I kind of was also a little bit tricked by this idea of the first exception of the rule where black can hold due to the opposite color. I thought maybe he could just kind of sit there. He was very confident too, my young opponent. You could tell that he believed in this first rule, that it was simply impossible for the side with just a little bit of initiative to win. He was thinking in terms of the first rule, where the rooks are off. But it turns out this is winning, I think. And the first idea I have here is to put my bishop on d7, to walk my king to c6, and then play some kind of maneuver with rook b8. He'll play bishop c5, of course. Rook takes b6, bishop takes b6, king takes b6, king takes a5, and then march my a pawn in. And it's going to be very hard to stop, and the reason for that is simple. The rook on e7 is passive. That's his main problem. Okay, so like I said, this is a psychological situation, and my opponent now played king f6, trying to activate. I played bishop d7. I'm in no hurry, and he plays rook h7. I came back. I'm not in a rush. I think my opponent should now play rook e7, and I can continue the initiative with the rook f8, and then bring the rook back, still play bishop d7 with a fine position. But I realized that he would try to maybe break out, and that's what he did, and I think it's a mistake. He played h5. So he was passive before, and now he's trying to break out of his shell, but it's a little too late. All of my pieces are super active, and when I play bishop d3, he has to go to the incredibly inconvenient square of rook h6. And now things were kind of simple. I played rook c7, threatening mate. Notice again that what I said before. The reason that in opposite color positions the initiative is so important is that when I attack on my color, in this case I'm on the light, my opponent does not have a bishop to oppose me. So already I can create incredible threats, like here I'm threatening mate. He comes back bishop e7, and I played a move that I realized was winning, but there was a much prettier way. I played rook c1, and I'll show you that continuation in a second, but I could have won in a very pretty fashion here with h4. The point being there's no way for him to prevent me from knocking the king away from the bishop. For example, gh, g5. And I'll win the bishop, and with the bishop I've taken away the blockader of the e-pawn. Okay, so bishop e7, came back. King G7, Rook F1. Again threatening Rook F7. He defended. So now the point now is, though, is that his bishop now, well, first of all, his rook is still amazingly bad. And his bishop is going to have trouble defending both the b6 pawn and the advance of the e pawn. And so I just played it simple and safe here, human style. Bishop f5. He took. Rerouted the rook, king c6, and there's going to be no way to defend. So he tried rook f8, basically a trick. If I take the pawn on b6, he has bishop d4 check. But I just played rook e1. He threatened the rook. And now there's no way to prevent the advance of the e-pawn, which we remember was the second weakness. The pawn on b6 is being attacked, and this pawn on e6 wants to queen. He resigned here, but it could have been something like bishop c5, e7, rook e8, king d7, king f7, bishop h5. Once I get the pawn securely on e7, clearly the bishop's power and the light squares can't be opposed for the queening square on e8. Okay, so let's look at another example. So this is our second example, and this was taken from Vinay Bhatt versus Kraai, also in December 2005. Vinay is an international master and one of America's top juniors. So we reached this position, and I felt this position was very instructive for me understanding how the bishop of the opposite color worked. So the first issue is that White's bishop is much worse than mine. And the reason for that is that his pawns, particularly on b3 and d5, get in his own bishop's way. My bishop, on the other hand, has really good chances of attacking on the dark squares. The next problem for White is that he really can't get at me. For example, if he plays f5, I can play bishop e5 and just shut everything down and keep this attack on the dark squares going. Okay, so please remember the overwhelming point of what I'm trying to say here is that the side with the initiative, it's like they'll have an extra piece on the color in which they're attacking. So in this position, the bishop on the light squares can't do anything to me on the light squares because it's blocked in by its own pawns. And so because it can't develop an initiative, I'm free to develop my own initiative with my strong bishop. Okay, so the game continued like this. King h2, and I just improved the position of my king, king g7. And now White really has a problem. If he leaves my rook there, it's going to be an attacking force. And if he takes it, I'm going to get a passed pawn. And I'm not sure, I mean, like, imagine, let's say he plays rook e8. There's nowhere that he's actually going to go from rook e8. It's not going to be possible to really attack me. I'm going to come in with a counterattack with queen b6 and queen d4 very quickly, and my rook on c3 will, of course, be a huge attacking force. So he took, and I took. Now, what was instructive to me about this game was that I realized I had an advantage here, and I realized I couldn't lose. But what I didn't really understand was that White's basically lost here. And that was a big revelation to me. And again, it's going to come down to this principle of two weaknesses. So the first problem that White has is obvious. This pawn can advance, and he can't let it advance. But the second thing isn't so obvious. The second weakness is that I can attack White's king on the dark squares, and there's not a whole lot that White can do about it, because again, he can't oppose me on those squares. So you look at this position, and if you're thinking in terms of bishops of opposite colors with the first rule in mind, that it's always a draw, then you'll be incredibly misguided. Watch how fast White's position falls apart here. So he comes back with the bishop. That makes sense. So now my c2 pawn, my c3 pawn is blocked. I activate the queen, and then I centralize the queen. We see I'm going to have two attacks with the queen against the blockading c2 bishop and against the dark squares around the white king. Queen e4, queen f2, bishop d3, bishop d4. In a way, very simple. So now the queen is threatening things like h4 and queen g1 mate. And I'm also, the white queen, on the other hand, and the white bishop have to worry about the c3 pawn. And so after queen f3, I just play queen e1. And my opponent here resigned, because I'm threatening bishop g1, king h1, bishop f2, king h2, queen g1 mate. Maybe I should do that. Let's say, I don't know, basically if he plays, let's say b4, then we can get this mechanism going. And if he plays queen f1, which would be the natural move, then again it's the principle of two weaknesses. I can take the queen, and the pawn advances. He can't defend against both. So what was instructive to me about this game was that the second weakness, the king, wasn't immediately obvious. And the point was, once I started attacking at the white king, it was like I was a piece up, because the bishop, the light squared bishop, could not defend the dark squares. So, in summary, I'd just like to say this. This is a very hard truth to realize because it's not so obvious. And the reason that a lot of players don't realize this is precisely because it's not so obvious. Most players genuinely think, at least most players, say under 2300, think that if you have bishops of opposite colors, it's going to be a draw. This is just a complete illusion, and if I showed you anything today, I hope I showed that. Even though, and if you're a lower rated player, what I want to say is this: just because higher rated players don't realize this truth, I don't think it's such a hard thing to understand, really. The reason they don't get it is that it's not obvious that black essentially has an extra piece when he's attacking the black king, the opponent's king, like in a position like that. It's just not intuitively obvious that he has an extra piece, when in fact he does. And hopefully this lecture will have made that at least somewhat clear, though I think really this knowledge comes with experience. And that experience will probably be gained by losing before you win. This is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you got something out of this Bishops of Opposite